and I looked to see where the microphone quit working, and it was right there. So we're going to pick up immediately where we left off, and that's at the very bottom of page 68 with the very last sentence. For those of you that were watching yesterday, I think you figured out that my most favorite part of the book is where Grandpa Lucas and Liz are talking on the porch, and she's been mending his quilt called Southern Skies, which you can see right here. I hope you're seeing the relationship that Liz has with her grandfather. She came to live with him at the timber mill, the Riverton Timber Mill, when she was a young girl. She was very young, but she was old enough to remember. She was old enough to remember losing her parents in a house fire and coming to live there with Grandpa Lucas. And as the stories develop, you'll find out more about that fire and even the story of how her and her sister Megan got to Grandpa Lucas. He was not even aware that anything was wrong and that those two little girls were coming to live with him. So in our story, it's 1856. It's just a few years before the Civil War. They're in Louisiana. It's Liz, who is our main character, her grandfather, Grandpa Lucas, her sister, Megan, her younger sister, her son, Luke, named after the grandfather, Grandpa Lucas, and her husband, Caleb. Her husband, Caleb, we find out in these first few chapters, was killed about a year ago in a accident at the timber mill. He had fallen into the logs and was drowned and was swept downriver, and they never found his body. And she continues to hold out hope that someday he will come back home to them. Everyone is telling her that she needs to move on with her life, and even a little bit of matchmaking is going on. Now, when Caleb came to the timber mill years ago, he came with his best friend Thomas, and Thomas has lived there at the timber mill and has helped work. And with Caleb passing away, Thomas has jumped right in there to help Grandpa Lucas with the timber mill. So they're loading up their wagons and they're going west to Fort Worth, Texas. And they're just on their very first day out, and that's where our story picks up in chapter 7 at the bottom of page 68. And they've stopped for a little bit of a break. The women strolled leisurely back to the wagons to find the men with their hats over their eyes, napping and obviously in no rush at all to start the wagons rolling again. The ladies giggled, and after a brief moment of whispering discussion, decided to wake them. Thomas looked up, his eyes half squinted from sleep. What is it? Has Chet returned yet? No, Liz said, smiling at his sleepiness. John awoke and leaned forward, listening from underneath one of the wagons, and Blue groaned as he sat upright from against a thick tree trunk. What if he's been bitten by a snake? Emma speculated. Ladies, please, John said. You're only scaring yourselves. He hasn't been gone that long. There's nothing to worry about. Just a little scouting trip. John looked to Thomas, somewhat confused over the situation. Well, what are we going to do about this? Emma demanded. What if he's not back by nightfall? What would you like us to do? Thomas asked calmly. Well, Emma said, I would only hope that you wouldn't be so passive if I were the one out there and had been gone for this long. Emma, Liz looked at Thomas and stepped in. Let's not worry about it just yet. We must hope that everything is fine and he will return soon. We can't worry like this every time Chet leaves to scout out our trail. Can't we go look for him? Emma pressed. Thomas pushed up to his feet and grabbed hold of the horse's ropes and loosened them from the tree. I will go and search for him. Where will you go? Emma questioned. I'll follow the river a short way, he said, and then he paused. And I'll come back a different route. Blue and John stepped closer to Thomas's horse as Luke listened, in silence, half asleep. Is all this really necessary? He asked, rubbing his eyes. Do you want one of us to go with you? No, it's best that you stay here. I need you to stay with the women. And keep them calm, he said, pulling himself onto the horse. I'll be back soon. Don't come looking for me. Thomas immediately left on horseback and pushed through the thick area, disappearing at once. I just know something is wrong, Emma exclaimed. I knew he had been gone for far too long. What will we do without a scout? We can't. Emma, please, Liz said. It's not certain that anything is wrong at all. Thomas will find Chet, if he needs to be found at all, and they will return soon. Yes, exactly, Abby said before turning suddenly to Blue for reassurance. Liz swallowed her own worry, only pausing to look after Thomas's trail for a moment. Nightfall would come soon. The sun had already dipped low in the sky, and the heat of the day had passed. The silent calm that covered her seemed to wind its way through the rest of the group. No one seemed sure what to do or say. John looked up from the small log on which he perched. Well, he said, slightly muffled, let's get supper on and make ready for nightfall. We have plenty of food to eat, Abby said. Yes, Liz jumped in. It's only the first day. We've plenty to eat. Besides, she said seriously, I would suspect that we should have things in order when Chet and Thomas return. John stood up quickly and placed his hat over his head. Blue and I will tend to the horses and wagons. Luke, help the ladies collect wood for fire. Luke nodded his head and immediately set out on the search. The forest was heavy with an almost impenetrable underbrush in places. It seemed like a deep ocean that someone could fall into and easily disappear. Thomas waded through the brush looking for signs that Chet might have left behind. He figured Chet should be easy to follow since he hadn't been gone for long, and he hadn't been trying to hide his tracks. But something still gnawed at Thomas's insides. He peered into a small clearing and blinked hard. That can't be. Chet's painted pony stood before him, riderless. The calm horse casually munched on a green bush, one bridle rein dragging the rocky edge of the stream. The horse looked up, chewing, and shook his head as if to say hello. He whinnied at Thomas and quickly returned to his supper. Thomas rode up close, swung one leg over the mare, and slid down. He patted the pony and checked for signs that would tell him how Chet might have displaced from his mount. He found no blood from the horse or from the rider. The saddlebag and bedroll were intact and showed no signs of a struggle. Everything seemed as safe and normal as a church picnic. Thomas scouted the area for a trail or clue about Chet's whereabouts. His eyes skimmed the water, and he walked to the far edge of the clearing. Something barely caught his ear. The day had now grown to a dusky dark, making it difficult to see through the shadows. But he saw Chet sprawled on the ground, his head by the edge of a sharp rock with dried blood coating both his hairline and the rock near Chet's head. Chet, Thomas said softly, what happened? You all right? Chet moaned again and briefly opened his eyes. I knew, Chet struggled to utter each word. You would come. The women made you. Thomas cleaned the cut and washed away the blood with cool water. He gave Chet a drink of water from his canteen. The head injury didn't appear to be very serious, but Thomas wrapped his friend's head with a long rag and pulled it tight before he tethered the horse to a tree line and unsaddled them for the night. Your head isn't bleeding too badly, but it's too dark to ride back tonight. We will have to camp here until morning, he explained. The forest surrounded them on all sides, making it difficult to set up camp. Thomas cleared the leaf-strewn ground for their bedrolls and quickly built a small fire. Thomas wondered what might have happened to Chet and his pony. It seemed unusual to him how Chet, an excellent rider who worked so well with his horse, had been overcome in such a way. Like all Texas cowboys, Chet took great pride in that horse of his. He spent a great amount of time training his mount exactly as he had wanted. Thomas ran his hand down the leg of the filly again and lifted her foot. What had made him fall? Thomas asked himself again. When he couldn't find the answer, he concentrated on how to make Chet more comfortable for the night. Each time he tried to move him, Chet moaned in pain. He went over each bone for breaks, but all seemed well, just one nasty cut and a bruise on his head. He wished he were back at the wagons with a needle and thread nearby. Emma always had her quilting bag of supplies close to her. With his head resting on his own saddle, Thomas's eyes began to droop as he drifted toward sleep when the sound of heavy footsteps padded close to the small clearing. Startled, he opened one eye and both ears. He couldn't see anything, but the horse appeared to sense the danger as they tossed their manes. Thomas slowly moved his hand to the side of his leg where he'd strapped his gun. He slipped it gently from the holster, waiting. The horse settled slightly, but Thomas felt as though something or someone watched him. He didn't know how or why Chet had been thrown from his saddle, but the whole situation seemed amiss, and his sense of duty to Lucas's granddaughters throttled him around the throat. A few moments passed before Thomas sat up and stirred the fire. He placed more wood on the burning coals. He intended to keep the fire burning high tonight. He glanced over at Chet, who slept soundly. One slight crack of wood sent Thomas's hand lunging for his gun again, and he rested it on the grip as he surveyed their surroundings. Bear sat silently next to Luke at the campfire. While John and Blue talked about the turn of events from the day and considered their options for the morning, Liz sat with Emma, chatting quietly. With his hand resting on his crossed front paws, Bear's eyes followed each of the men as they talked. Suddenly the dog's nostrils flared, and he picked up an unusual scent. His nose twitched, trying to get more of the smell. Immediately the dog rose and hastily bounded into the darkness. "What is it, boy?" Luke asked, looking through the undercarriage of the wagons and wheels. He tried to adjust his eyes to the blackness of the night after staring at the campfire for so long. Bear, up on all fours, had alerted to something. He let out a low growl. Liz had been around the dog enough to know that he meant business. His throat puffed and his black lips curled, exposing black gums and long pointed teeth. The deep growl continued and grew more intense. He now had the attention of Blue and John, now standing with guns in hand. Liz's thoughts flew to Abby and Megan, who had already retired for the night. "Luke, get your mother and her cousins into the wagon," Blue ordered sharply. "Yes, sir," Luke answered, and he flew to his feet. As his eyes searched the darkness, he grabbed Liz by the elbow and softly commanded, "Let's go, Mom, into the wagon." Liz went into full mother hen mode, nudging Emma along like a baby chick toward the nearest wagon. "Liz," Emma squealed, "shh, let's do as they've asked and get inside." "What is it?" she heard Luke ask the men. "I don't know," Blue said, "but the back of my neck is crawling." "I don't like it at all," John said quietly, his fingers tapping the trigger of his revolver. Bear's gaze never left the small gap in the trees. He prowled toward it and let out a fierce growl that Liz didn't know her son's dog could make. Suddenly, a white form emerged. Megan, in her nightgown, was panting and looking around frantically. Her face was white as a ghost. "Megan, what are you doing out here?" Blue swore, irritated and relieved as he lowered his gun. "Are you alone?" John let out a breath and bent over to his knees. Bear ran to the opening Megan had flown through, his throat still rumbling. "Come here, boy," Liz pressed, but Bear didn't move. "What was that? Did you see it?" Megan panted, trying to catch her breath. "We didn't see anything. We only heard it," Blue said. "Or heard you. I'm not sure." "Well, what did you see?" John asked impatiently. Before she could reply, Blue interrupted. "Megan, you know not to go out alone." Liz sighed deeply. "What's going on?" Emma whispered. "What is it?" "Shh," Liz urged. Let's wait for them to call us out." "It was big with glowing eyes," Megan exclaimed. Liz's eyes widened. "It moved so quickly. Did you hear it? I haven't a clue as to what it was, but it could have gotten me. And it's still out there," she cried in a panic. "Where's Liz?" There, Luke answered, pointing to where she was waiting in the wagon. Liz drew back the tarp just in time for Megan to fly through it to her sister. Chapter 8. Chet's eyes were still shut as he asked, "Am I alive or dead?" He pressed his hand against his throbbing head. "Morning, cowboy. You still with me?" Thomas asked. "If I'm dead, surely my head wouldn't be hurting so badly. I must be alive then." "What happened?" Chet asked. "I was hoping you would give me the details," Thomas said, concerned at Chet's confusion. "Where's my pony? Is my girl fine?" he asked. Thomas had found some coffee in Chet's saddlebag, and he built a small fire to heat some water. He poured a cup of coffee and walked over to hand it to his friend. "She's fine. I checked her over last night and this morning, looking for a few answers. I tried to get her to tell me what happened," he said with a grin, but she wouldn't talk. Chet took the coffee Thomas offered and rested on one elbow. After taking a sip, he cringed. "Plenty hot, but not too good. I'd forgotten how bad your coffee is." Thomas watched Chet. He didn't look badly wounded. "Do you think you can ride today?" "I think so. How deep is the cut?" The open gash on his head still oozed, and the blood had matted at his hairline. "We need to get you to Miss Emma's sewing bag. She can put in a real neat stitch for you," Thomas teased him. "After breakfast, I figure I'll ride back to the camp and alert the others to where you are. We can bring the wagons through this way and settle you back on one until you're keen to ride again." Chet managed a small nod and carefully sipped his coffee. "So what made a cowboy like you get thrown from his best filly?" "Well," Chet cleared his throat and sat up to speak. "We were riding along the creek and she got spooked for no reason that I could tell. We were in this clearing and we were trapped with only one way out. I heard a growl that appeared to be close." Chet grew more excited as he spoke. Immediately, he clapped his hands together. "I looked up and could see a huge black panther about to lunge at us. Just then, Tessie bolted." Chet stopped and thought for a moment. "And that was the last thing I remember. I thought we were supper." "A panther?" Thomas questioned. "Yes, sir, I know it was." You didn't have any idea that this cat was after you?" "I've seen a few before, but they usually aren't so aggressive." "Yeah," Chet answered. "Tessie didn't even have much warning. Usually she can smell danger and warn me when something's coming." They both sipped their coffee. "Where did you find Tessie?" Chet asked. "Not too far from you right now. I could tell she'd been run hard, but she was calm when I rode close up on her." Chet lay back to rest his head on the saddle, closed his eyes. "Ride on back to camp. I'll be fine here." Thomas loosened his mare from the lanky oak tree that he'd fought all night for sleeping space. He checked his saddle mounted, and prepared to ride back to camp. "Chet, you rest a bit more. I'll be back with the wagons well by noon." At the breakfast campfire, Megan recounted her story for Abby, who had slept through the whole ordeal. "What was it exactly?" Megan said. "I'm not sure, but it was big, dark, and quick as lightning. That was the part that was so strange and frightening to me. It would have easily torn me to pieces." She shook when she'd gone over it again in her head. "Megan, I'm upset with your judgment. You should never go out like that. And you did not tell any of us," Liz scolded her sister. "You know, I always have to go at least one more time in the night, and I didn't want to disturb anyone. I honestly thought all of you were already asleep. It's only the second day, and we've already lost Thomas and Chet, and you go out at night all by yourself. How could you do something like that? I just don't understand. What if you don't come back? Then what would we do this morning with 3 people missing? We already don't know what to do now." Megan didn't say anything. "Well," Liz demanded an explanation. "I'm sorry, Liz, you're right." Megan lowered her head. "I shouldn't have done that." Blue approached the ladies from his wagon, pulling up his droopy pants along the way. He managed a groggy greeting for the women. "Morning." "Good morning," they replied flatly. He rinsed a tin cup and prepared to make coffee. Where is Luke? Liz directed to Blue. Still sleeping. Liz stood seriously and put her hands on her hips. What should we do this morning? Do we stay here and continue to wait, or do we go search for them? Blue looked up at her and grimaced. I don't think we should search for them, Abby said. I don't either, Emma agreed. Liz noticed the corner of Blue's mouth as it quirked. I don't think that would be wise either. We need to stay here and wait. That's all we can do. If they come back and we're not here... Right then, over the hill that blocked their campsite from the river, they all seemed to notice at the same time someone approaching on horseback. Who is it? Is it Chet? Emma asked. No, Liz exclaimed. It's Thomas. Thomas pulled back on the reins and the horse came to an abrupt stop as a group of them swiftly approached. Everything's fine, he greeted them, slightly out of breath. Chet is all right. He was thrown from his horse and injured his head, and he's going to be just fine. Thank God, Liz exclaimed. Thank God. Yes, his horse got spooked and threw him. He hit his head and was completely knocked out. I found him just as he came to. It was too dark for us to ride back to camp. What spooked his horse? Megan asked. He wasn't quite sure. Where is Chet now? He's waiting for us by the creek. Gracious Thomas, Liz said pensively. We were so worried. We didn't know what we would do this morning. Everything is fine now, Thomas reassured her over the thumping of her heart. Let's pack up. Chet's awaiting. As Thomas dismounted and joined in the process of packing up, Liz noticed him look up, and she followed his gaze. The southern sky had quickly turned green and dark. It took some time to hitch up 6 teams of horses and wagons. Finally, they rolled out of camp, Thomas in the lead wagon once again. He had instructed them that they would travel in a single wagon row because of the narrow path he had encountered along the small river, and they followed along the creek until it forked south. To the southwest, darkness and fast-moving rain clouds would soon block the sun out completely. Thomas slowed the lead wagon to an abrupt halt and jumped down. He loosened his horse and walked back to the others. Thomas, Blue called out over the whipping wind. Those clouds are moving fast. He took off his hat and looked up to the dark sky. I've been watching them as we rode, Blue said. I thought they would move north, away from us. Everyone stay in the wagon, Thomas ordered. He looked directly at Liz, adding, Chet is down through the brush over there. I'll go get him. Liz nodded and called out to him loudly above the whipping wind. Be careful, Thomas. Her concern for him stroked an ember or two in the center of his chest. Thomas rode down a steep hill and into the brush. The trees grew thicker the closer he came to the creek. Before he reached the bottom of the hill, he had already felt raindrops on his neck. His horse shivered from an unexpected south wind. Ooh, that's cold, Bootsy, his horse grunted. Keep going, we're almost there. Bootsy plowed her way through the thick bushes. Small branches scraped across Thomas's face as he tried to shield himself with his arm. A narrow area of smooth stones and rocks bordered the skinny river and made it less thick with growth. Just as Thomas reached the area, he saw Chet's horse and bag. Chet, he called out from atop his own horse. He spotted Chet seated on a fallen tree as he enjoyed a piece of dried meat. Chet, we've got to get going. A storm's coming in. The long rag Chet had worn across his head now protruding from his back pocket. How do you feel? Asked Thomas. I can ride, he answered as he hurried to place his cup and food into Tessie's saddlebag and hastily hopped into the saddle. The flaps on Liz's bonnet pressed against her face. A fierce gust of wind caught her attention, compelling her to look up. The huge dark storm had already pressed upon them. We should take cover, she thought. As a young child, Liz had been taught how to read the weather and how to distinguish a severe storm from a mere rainstorm. She wondered how this one had crept up on her. She had educated Luke with all she learned about the weather, and they'd always pulled together to prepare for such circumstances. She felt a little frustrated over allowing the storm to catch her off guard. Hazardous hazardous widowmakers hung over Blue's horse at the back of the wagon train. A strong flurry of wind blew across the trees, and suddenly, with a back crack, one of them collapsed to the ground in one swift movement. As the limbs hit the ground, Blue's horse spooked from the commotion and immediately tried to take off in a dead gallop. Blue yanked back on the reins with all his strength as Emma and Abby screamed. Blue shouted at the horses as he tried to gain control, but he couldn't seem to manage them. As the horses and wagons sprinted to safety, the back wheel clipped the side of Luke's wagon, sparking chaos in that team. Still hitched to their wagons, the horses ran off in panic. The rain pelted stronger, and lightning flashed. Luke and Blue, still on their wagons, struggled to gain control of their frenzied team. Lightning illuminated the dark sky, revealing a snaking twister that reached towards the ground with smoky fingers. Liz gasped as she watched the tornado fly over the trees. Her own heart felt paralyzed with fear as she watched the funnel approaching the ground. Cold rain splashed her before the storm whirled around her and pelted faster with each frantic breath she took. Liz found it difficult to see as the rain and wind whipped her hair and bonnet. Panic began to swell inside of her. "Twister," Liz called to the frantic group as Blue and Luke steered their wagons back toward them. "Take cover. It's coming our way. We need to find a low spot. Get to shelter." Blue pointed toward a ravine just a short way from them. The teams of horses seemed as eager as the drivers to find safety, and they moved without prompting. It surprised Liz to find how easy it was to get the wagons to the ravine, and they made it there quickly. The horses became jittery because of the hailstones that bounced on their targets. The men had nothing to which they could fasten their teams, and Liz felt alarm building with that frightening horses might spook and bolt again. Abby, Emma, and Megan also had found their way to safety, and Luke stood away from the shelter holding his team, while John, Blue, Luke, and Liz each did their best to keep their teams calm during the worst of it. Hail pounded across Liz's shoulder as she tried to protect herself next to the animals and at the same time hold onto the reins to keep her horses calm. Her bonnet flew up, and she found herself soaked to the skin and shivering almost immediately. She nestled in closer to one of her horses and tucked her head under the soft velvet line of its neck. She wondered who actually comforted whom. The wind whipped her dress around her legs in a tight embrace. When she glanced out to see how Luke fared, her bonnet flew back from her head, and a hailstone pelted her on the mouth. Her lips felt numb from the cold, and she tasted blood. Liz dropped her head down, seeking the protection of her horse, while sobs escaped from her. Almost before she even realized she was crying, she continued to weep as the rain mixed with her tears. She could not keep the sensation away. With the storm came a feeling of hopelessness, and the rain that hit her face beat memories of the Riverton meal and the day that she became the widow of Caleb Bromont straight out of her. What happened to the good luck that the Irish chain anniversary quilt is supposed to bring? Thoughts of Caleb summoned fear and dread for their son, and Liz shoved the wet hair from her face as she looked for Luke. The storm still raged, but his two teams did well. The hail had passed quickly, and hopefully the threat of the twister too. "Liz," Abby called, "hurry, come inside. The thunder is almost gone now. The horses will be fine." Abby had untied the strings of the wagon cover and held them tightly as the wind whipped about to keep it from invading her almost dry habitat. Liz spoke a word of encouragement to the animals and pulled her black boots from the mud and streams of water that flooded past her ankles. Her saturated dress had lost all of its absorbing power. The water now flowed past her hemline. She felt bone-tired as she waded toward Abby, her dress weighing more than she did. She nearly missed the wooden foothold on the wagon bed, and as she climbed up to comfort, her heel caught at the edge of her skirt, ripping it at the waist. Off balance, her hand slipped off the top edge of the wagon, and she fell, hitting her cheekbone on the wooden sideboard. Abby heard the whack of Liz's face against the wagon. "Oh my, Liz, are you hurt?" she cried. Liz climbed into the wagon, falling into a state of exhaustion with mud, blood, and tears burning over her cut and swollen face. Seeing her cousin's distress, Abby quickly went to work. "Megan and Emma are in the wagon over there," she motioned toward the back corner of the wagon as she cared for Liz's sliced cheek and pulled out some dry things for her. She turned to grab the cords of the wagon cover, peeking out quickly before pulling them tight again and dropping the big flap from the top. She pulled another string around a toggle nailed to the wagon's inside. Luke just climbed into his wagon and the men are headed to theirs. Hopefully the worst is over. "Oh, Liz, you are drenched and bleeding. I hope you don't catch your death of a cold. Hurry and dry yourself off." Liz pulled the remnant of her dress from her body as she swept her hair up in the empty flour sack. Abby saw her battered shoulder where the hailstones had bruised her skin. Liz jumped as the cotton sack touched her tender shoulder. "I feel beaten inside and out. I don't know which is worse," she confided in Abby. Then, in an effort to reassure herself, she asked, "Luke's in his wagon?" "Yes." "I hope he has his pinwheel quilt where he can use it." Liz had quilted Luke's quilt with wool batting from Mrs. Dongren's flock of sheep. Liz thought she made the best wool batting. However, she could only afford one length a year. "It will keep Luke dry. It's the best for humid climates, though. Oh, I must be delirious rambling on like this, dear Abby." Liz popped her head into the surprisingly dry and welcome nightgown. The rain continued to come down in sheets all night long. Liz felt so exhausted that once again she fell asleep nearly the moment her head hit the pillow. She pulled Abby's soft, worn quilt up to her battered shoulder and snuggled into its comfort and warmth. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered if Caleb would arrive in the morning and take them safely to their new home in the West. Somewhere in her sleepy thoughts came the realization that Caleb would never rescue her again. She was on her own. And that ends chapter 8. We will start with chapter 9. Tomorrow we'll do 9 and 10. I hope you are enjoying the reading of our story. And those of you that are interested in e-readers, you can get those wherever you normally purchase your e-reader books. Just look for Jodi Barrows and the Threads of Change series. Threads of Change, Threads of Home, and Threads of Courage. Book number 4 is in the process, and it is Threads of Hope. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.